the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor, and it gives us great pleasure to be hosting this amazing series, Revolution in the Air, with the Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park. And I'm going to turn it over to Ranger Mello from sunny Florida. He is taunting his weather at us, but at least he came in from the pool where he was earlier. Ranger Mello?
Thank you, Devin, and thank you to the Heritage Corridor, as always, for hosting this. To Devin's point, for those of you who do not know, I accepted what's called a detail in the National Park Service, which basically means I'm on a temporary assignment for the next 3 months. And I'm at Big Cypress National Preserve right now in southern Florida right now. So the weather is substantially nicer than back at home, but no need to fear. I will be back in the valley by the end of May when it gets really hot down here. So it works out nicely in the long run. But thank you all for joining us for this next edition of our winter lecture series, Revolution is in the Air. This is the fourth lecture so far. It's tough to believe that we're already past the halfway mark. Good sign that spring is on its way and hopefully returning to some normalcy coming in the spring and summer. If you have missed any of these, just a reminder that we do record them and post them on our YouTube channel. So if you have missed any of the previous ones or you miss any of our future ones, you can always find them on the Parks YouTube channel. Also, a quick reminder that if you have any questions or comments, always encouraged, do type those into the chat option. So that's that little bubble that looks like a talking symbol on the bottom of your screen. A side window will pop up on the side and you can type your questions or comments into that, and that will be greatly appreciated. I have the honor today to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Evelyn Stern. Evelyn Stern is an associate professor of history and the director of the Center for Humanities at the University of Rhode Island. Her research focuses on the varieties of religious expressions in early 20th century America. The author of Ballots and Bibles, Ethnic Politics in the Catholic Church in Providence, she is currently writing a book about the House of David, a religious commune that drew believers from around the world to a tiny town in Michigan. Today, Dr. Stern will be talking about ethnic politics in the Catholic Church in Rhode Island. So without any further ado, Dr. Stern, thank you for joining us today, and the virtual room is yours.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that nice introduction, and thank you to the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor for hosting this great series. I'm going to take a moment, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your Saturday to listen to this talk. I'm going to just take a moment to share my screen as I have some slides to go along with my presentation. Okay, here we go. I thought I'd start today by telling you a little bit about the research I did for this project and how I became interested in it. Some years ago, I published a book called Ballots and Bibles, Ethnic Politics in the Catholic Church in Providence. The book uses Providence as a case study to explore the ways in which religion influenced ethnic politics in debates about Americanism between about 1840 and 1940. I was particularly interested in how Irish, Italian, and French Canadian immigrants used religion in political ways, drawing on the resources of Catholicism to enter politics and engage in public life. When I started grad school with a focus on US immigration and labor history, I came in with the assumption that religion mattered to workers and immigrants in the industrial era, not only as a belief system, but also as a community. So I was really surprised to see that the Catholic Church, religious home of most immigrants at the turn of the 20th century, was virtually absent from most of the history I was reading, particularly in labor history. The church generally entered the story only in a negative way, presented as an unfortunate influence that discouraged workers and immigrants from engaging in more radical or political forms of activism. It seemed to me the story was much more complicated. First of all, the church was a place where a lot of new Americans spent time. To dismiss what they did there was to miss an important part of their stories. Secondly, perhaps immigrants who chose to be Catholics rather than socialists or communists made logical choices. Rather than viewing them as the victims of false consciousness, the dupes of conservative priests, perhaps we should try to understand their decisions. They may have derived real benefits from being members of a religious community, benefits historians have overlooked because Catholicism prevented immigrants from doing the kinds of things many think they should have done. So I decided to write a book that would explore the connections between Catholicism and ethnic politics in a much more nuanced way. I chose Providence as a case study because it was a heavily immigrant, largely Catholic city, and one that hadn't been studied as extensively as, say, New York or Boston. In order to find out more about Catholicism and ethnic politics, I read about 40 years of the Providence Visitor, the weekly Catholic newspaper, in the course of which I developed a passionate hatred for microfilm. And I realize I'm dating myself by even mentioning microfilm. Much more fun was looking at parish records, many of which, ironically, I had to travel to other states to find. Parish histories, bulletins, and financial records, correspondence between parishioners and priests, bishops' diaries, and so forth. I also read union records, labor newspapers, socialist newspapers, the French-Canadian paper Le Jean Baptiste, and the English language sections of the Italian Echo. This helped me situate Catholicism within the context of ethnic and working class politics in this period. I also used city directories, tax lists, and census records to do some fun micro-social history and find out more about individuals who were active in their parishes. I should mention that although my research focuses on Providence, I also found lots of great stories from other industrial areas like Woonsocket. Based on careful readings of these sources, I became convinced that the Catholic Church was far and away the most important institution in ethnic working class communities between the 1890s and the 1920s, the period of the so-called new immigration. This is what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. First, I'll tell you why the church was important. Then I'll discuss how Catholics use religion in political ways, tapping into the institutional and rhetorical resources of their religion to influence public life. Third, I'll talk about how the importance of the church could sometimes backfire, generating conflict as well as community. And I should mention that the picture here, in case you don't recognize it, is the picture of the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul in Providence. So why was the church so important? Perhaps the most important reason was accessibility. At this point in history, the church was the only institution where every single Catholic could be a member. This was a time when most immigrants couldn't get into unions, when ethnic mutual aid societies limited their membership to men, and when many immigrants could not or did not vote because of citizenship, language, sex, race, age, literacy, or voting restrictions. As some of you know, in Rhode Island, you had to own property to vote in city elections until the stunningly late date of 1928. What all this means is that the places we usually think of as immigrant organizing spaces, union halls, political machine headquarters, and ethnic mutual aid societies, were off limits to a lot of new Americans. The parish was the only place where every Catholic could be a member. And many, although certainly not all, Catholics took advantage of this opportunity for 4 reasons. The first and most important was faith. Common sense suggests that even Catholics who arrived as lukewarm believers looked to religion for comfort as they confronted the trials of life in the New World. And here's a picture of the first immigrants arriving at this new state pier in Providence in 1913. By the same logic, even occasional churchgoers recognized that the church was a community anchor, a substitute for the support networks that had sustained them in the old country. Third, ethnic parishes helped to preserve old world identities as immigrants found themselves under pressure to assimilate. Fourth, parishes served as alternative political vehicles for new Americans who lacked other effective means of self-assertion. Thus, even though many immigrants rejected Catholicism for personal or political reasons, and I certainly don't mean to suggest that all Catholics were active churchgoers, many more welcomed the parish as spiritual support, community center, and organizing base. Let's turn first to the issue of church as community. In Providence, as in other Catholic cities, the church was the nucleus of neighborhood life. No other institution could match the parish as a source of service and sociability, relief and recreation. At a time when immigrants had serious problems and few sources of public assistance, the church played an indispensable role as a dispenser of charity. The diocese ran hospitals, orphanages, and working girls' homes, while some individual parishes operated day nurseries. Father Joseph Bourgeois of St. John's in Arctic gave away coal to his poorest parishioners, while Father Cooney at St. Edward's in Providence helped his Irish congregation to deal with difficult employers or drunken spouses. While the neediest Catholics looked to the church for charity, others took advantage of parish educational programs that facilitated their upward mobility. Parochial schools educated the young, St. Anne's offered classes in English and Italian, and the School of Domestic Arts at St. Mary's in Pawtucket trained women of all ages in cooking, nursing, and dressmaking. Many of these programs encouraged immigrants to assimilate, even as they preserved elements of their old world identities. And here is a picture of a group of French Canadian schoolgirls. The church was also a critical source of information, a valuable commodity to newly arrived immigrants. The Visitor printed government news, offered health and household tips, and took stands on everyday problems such as street repairs and the rising price of trolley tickets, a hot issue at the turn of the 20th century, as you'll know if you've read Scott Malloy's wonderful book on the trolley wars. Individual parishes such as St. Mary's and St. Bartholomew's published their own bulletins that carried city and parish news. And here, just in reference to my comment about trolley workers, is a turn of the century, actually 1894 photograph of a trolley worker and some passengers. These Catholic newspapers and bulletins encouraged readers to go to Mass, but they also urged them to take advantage of a truly impressive parish-based recreational life. In any given year, the typical ethnic parish sponsored a packed social calendar of fairs, plays, concerts, bingo games, costume parties, and dances. Many events took place in parish halls that offered billiard rooms and bowling alleys, libraries and reading rooms, gymnasiums and bathing facilities. Some parishes even offered their own movie theaters. Parish halls also hosted meetings for the lay societies that abounded in this era. When I sat down to make a list of all the organizations you could join at a Providence parish, I was really quite amazed. And if you'll indulge me, here's a list. Rosary societies and altar guilds, temperance and holy name societies, sewing circles and St. Vincent de Paul societies, debating clubs, lecture series and study groups, bands, sports teams, drama societies, glee clubs, and scout troops. In 1910, Father Antonio Bove of St. Anne's boasted, "In my parish, there is a religious society suitable for every person in the congregation." He wasn't kidding, and many of the city's other priests could have made the same claim. So here's a picture of the aforementioned Father Bove in the hat and priest collar, of course, with the St. Anne's baseball team. And again, Father Bove with the St. Anne's band. So in all these ways, the parish offered members a social and spiritual center in an urban setting that otherwise could be alienating and unstructured. The parish, as one historian puts it, functioned both as a mini city and a macro family. The parish also served as a political organizing site, and this is what I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking about. Very few historians have considered Catholic churches as political vehicles, but it was quite natural for them to function in this capacity. The church was, after all, the place where people came together, forged solidarities, and learned to be organizers, fundraisers, and public speakers. Creating a parish was itself an act of community activism. Immigrants had to come together, petition the bishop, raise the money, collect the materials, and build the church. Once it was constructed, its survival depended on lay people contributing their monies and energies on a weekly basis. Priests may have controlled the spiritual life of the parish, but they depended on parishioners to raise the funds, teach the Sunday schools, operate the charities, and organize the entertainments. In other words, being an active Catholic required people to develop skills as organizers and fundraisers, skills they could apply to community activism. In the course of participating in parish life, Catholics also cemented powerful solidarities. Women's Blessed Virgin sodalities and men's holy name societies, for example, brought members together on a regular basis and created bonds that extended beyond the walls of the church. These societies took communion as a body on designated Sundays and marched through the streets, placing a religious seal on their group identity. There was no more powerful statement of Catholic cohesion than the triennial Holy Name Parade. These links forged at church reinforced those developed in the community, and for some parishioners, the political machine or the union hall. And they functioned as what the visitor called religion in action, sending outsiders a clear message about Catholic power. And one such demonstration was the triennial Holy Name Parade mentioned a moment ago. And here's a picture of it marching past the cathedral in 1922. If parish life helped Catholics develop skills and contacts that could benefit them as politicians or activists, it also enabled them to develop informed opinions on current events. Parish debating societies and study circles enabled immigrants, many of whom lacked much formal education, to discuss issues such as temperance and socialism and develop their own opinions. St. Charles in Woonsocket even formed its own school for social studies. Some Catholics became accomplished speakers through institutions like these. In 1923, a team from Holy Ghost beat a Boston congregation in a debate over the League of Nations. The visitor proudly attributed the victory to the popularity of the Holy Ghost Lyceum, whose weekly lecture series, it wrote, turns out orators and debaters as a Ford factory does Fords. Belonging to a parish society was also an exercise in self-government. Each organization had officers who were elected annually or as often as every 6 months. Some societies really embraced this. The Women's Guild at St. Edward's not only chose a slate of general officers, but even held elections for its subcommittees. As this example suggests, the benefits of parish organizing were particularly valuable for women who lacked other means of political expression. It was not surprising that many Catholics drew on the skills, opinions, and solidarities formed at church to become active in the community. Parish societies were ready-made units that could take on neighborhood problems or engage with city politics. And by the turn of the century, Catholics were beginning to consciously use the parish as a bridge between private devotion and public activism. The 1905 state census revealed that almost 52% of Providence residents and just under 51% of all Rhode Islanders were Catholic. Confident in their new status as the majority religion, they unleashed a movement to secure balance for a proportional share of political power. As the visitor complained, "We have never received at the hands of the state that consideration which is due to the great number of Catholics. There are many things still due to us from the state, and these we should insist upon getting." The visitor was right. Catholics were the majority, but they still lacked protections at the workplace, full access to the vote, and social acceptance in the community. Priests and lay people responded with a vigorous movement to enhance their influence and secure their rights. Using the visitor as a mouthpiece and their lay societies as organizing vehicles, they began to work harder to elect their own and to lobby for workplace laws and voting reform. By 1920, some lay organizations were conducting voter registration drives, lobbying on issues such as child labor and birth control, and speaking out against discrimination. And one such example of discrimination was the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, which was quite active in the 20s. The Klan was active all over the country in the 20s, and in places like Rhode Island, its target was not so much African Americans as immigrants and Catholics and Jews. And here's a Klan parade in Georgiaville in 1927. So this is one of many threats that Catholics rallied around and rallied against in the 20s. On a more subtle level, immigrants also used their religion to participate in a nationwide debate about American identity. Catholics in Rhode Island and across the nation faced the perennial charge that they were un-American because they belonged to a hierarchical church and owed their primary loyalty to the Pope. As a result, they had to work really hard to prove themselves good citizens and good Americans. Rhode Island Catholics were fond of noting that they had contributed to American life from the start, participating in the founding of the Republic, and going back even further, the discovery of the continent. A 1917 pamphlet even claimed, "Our Catholic American title deeds date back to the Norse explorers of the 12th century." Since then, Catholics argued their religion had fostered good citizenship by encouraging hard work, social service, and respect for the law. A 1917 editorial in The Visitor said it all. Good Catholicism is inclusive of good citizenship, and usually the better Catholic one is, the better citizen one makes. Claims like this were made not only in the pages of The Visitor, but also by rank and file Catholics who used public pageantry to prove that Catholicism and Americanism were compatible. Let me offer you an example. On July 16, 1906, Providence Italians took to the streets for the annual feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. After gathering for Mass, they paraded through Federal Hill. The streets were lined with spectators brandishing Italian and American flags, as well as pictures of the Virgin Mary clothed in the Italian national colors. Street vendors got into the spirit by adorning their pushcarts with patriotic decorations. After the parade, the bandstand was decorated with a large image of the Virgin against the backdrop of an American flag. This complex symbolism, blending sacred and secular, old world and new, sent a powerful message. It was possible to be American, Italian, and Catholic at the same time. And here's a picture, as you can tell, of this parade going along Atwells Avenue in 1906. This was a popular strategy among all ethnic groups. For the French Canadians and the Irish, Saint Jean Baptiste Day and St. Patrick's Day represented similar opportunities to celebrate both their Old World heritage and their New World loyalties. In this way, immigrants used public demonstrations to challenge a national identity that was grounded in Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. Americanism, they argued, was a dynamic concept that should evolve to include newer ethnic and religious traditions. Catholic immigrants thus used their parishes in two important ways: as neighborhood centers where they came together, and as springboards from which they became active in the life of the larger community. Nowhere else in Providence was there an institution where so many immigrants gathered regularly, discussed common problems, and acted as leaders. Yet the centrality of the church to ethnic life generated conflict as well as community. I'm sure some of you have heard about the conflicts between French Canadians and the Irish church hierarchy involving pew rent strikes, burning effigies, and of course the famous Sentinel affair of the 1920s. I'm going to spend the rest of my presentation today talking about an equally spectacular conflict among the Italians that you may not have heard of. I call this story Trouble at Holy Ghost. And here's a picture of Holy Ghost Parish on Federal Hill. On a warm Sunday in July 1920, Providence police officers received an unexpected summons to Holy Ghost on Federal Hill. Some 100 Italian women were trying to forcibly remove a priest from the church, and it took a posse of armed officers to stop them. According to an account in one local newspaper, the people absolutely want to remove Father Beliotti, and they are intent on doing so at whatever cost and by whatever means. The reporter was right. Over the next months, the police regularly were called in to keep the peace at Holy Ghost, as parishioners assembled for mass meetings and demonstrations aimed at ousting Beliotti and the Scalabrini fathers who ran the parish. At an August assembly, Il Corriere reported, the appearance of one priest unloosed such an uproar of screams and protests that it had the actual character of a riot. "No more Scalabrini," the parishioners screamed. "Either you get out or we will drive you out with force." When 3 months elapsed and the unpopular priests remained in place, parishioners concluded that force was the only solution. On the morning of Sunday, November 7th, police officers arrested 4 women and 3 men who had interrupted a service by shouting for the priest's removal and demanding the keys to the church. This dramatic series of events was the culmination of a 15-year battle between the Scalabrini Fathers, a northern Italian order, and the southern Italian lay people of Holy Ghost. For some time, parishioners had been complaining that Belliati and his colleagues were materialistic snobs rather than humble servants of God. No one would think they are priests, the church's Holy Name Society grumbled. Their demeanor, their clothes, their well-combed and perfumed hair, their manner of living, the levity with which they speak of their ministry, everything in them gives unmistakable signs that their faith is lukewarm, if not entirely gone. Particularly galling was Belliati's habit of wintering in Florida to improve his poor health, leaving his assistants to tend the flock in cold, gray Providence. And this picture of immigrants around a garbage dump on West Exchange Street, taken in 1903, just gives you a little bit of a window into the extreme poverty faced by so many members of Belliati's congregation. Worse still, parishioners charged the Scalabrini were dismissive of patron saints and feast days. In July 1906, 1 year after he assumed control of the congregation, Belliati had raised the parish's collective dander by tangling with the popular Madonna del Carmine festival. On the day of the festival, celebrants arrived at Holy Ghost 1 hour late to find the priest annoyed and their reserved seats filled, as they told a story in the heated petition to Bishop Matthew Harkins. The Reverend Father became irritated and cursed her name and also the day that he donned the priestly garments. He replied that we did not control him and that if we said another word, he would not let us enter the church, and furthermore, that he saw no difference between the Blessed Virgin and St. Rocco or any other saint. Such words were horrifying to a people whose Catholicism was grounded in the worship of village patron saints. The 1906 affair would be one in a series of conflicts that rocked Holy Ghost and other parishes during the years of mass immigration. In the summer of 1920, these long simmering tensions burst from the walls of Holy Ghost. The departure of Father Vincenzo Vaccari, a popular assistant priest not affiliated with the hated Scalabrini, unleashed a flood of impassioned letters and petitions to the bishop and even the Vatican. Parishioners demanded the return of the Vaccari, whom they credited with rescuing from this religious sloth thousands of Italians through his inspiring sermons and his sympathy for the poor. Belliati, by contrast, conducted himself as the manager of a business establishment instead of a pastor, they charged. He is never willing to raise his hand or do anything whatsoever unless he is compensated. The Vaccari controversy posed a major problem for the spiritual lives of Holy Ghost Catholics and the institutional health of the diocese. Parishioners pled with the bishop to help them in what they called a terrible moment, according to a petition bearing the names of 626 congregants. We have been minimized, insulted, beaten, arrested, denounced as a flock of primitives and criminals. And after such a disgrace to our name, to our dignity, we are to be compelled to return to our executioners. Such a course of action seemed intolerable, and many threatened to leave the church if Vaccari did not return. The church will close with no one attending anymore, one Catholic warned the bishop. God is present at other churches and also at home, noted another. This last statement sent diocesan officials a message that was disturbing on 2 counts. Disgruntled Catholics might flock to the Protestant missions in their neighborhood, but they were just as likely to practice their faith in a domus-centered lived religion that recognized homes as valid sites of worship. Given the size of the anti-Scalabrini movement, both threats were cause for concern. Even though community spokesmen tried to dismiss the uprising as the work of a discontented fringe, at least 1,200 women, 600 men, and 18 church societies signed petitions demanding the Scalabrinis' ouster and Vaccari's return. Comprising at least 1/3 of the congregation, this faction threatened the viability of Rhode Island's flagship Italian parish. Bishop William Hickey, who had assumed leadership of the diocese only recently, did not wish to sacrifice the hard-won advances his predecessors had made among the Italians. He refused to bring back Vicari, whom some suspected of fomenting the uprising, but he finally found an acceptable leader who restored peace to the turbulent parish. He also created a new Federal Hill Church devoted to the same Madonna of Mount Carmel whose feast day had touched off the trouble 15 years earlier. I spent a lot of time trying to untangle this fascinating incident. I can't come up with an easy explanation because none of the conflicts at Holy Ghost were clear-cut. The division between the Scalabrini and their congregation reflected the regional tensions that split Federal Hill between older immigrants from northern Italy and newer arrivals from the south. Yet Belliati himself was Sicilian. It may have been the Scalabrini issue more than the northern-southern conflict that was at work here. Providence, incidentally, wasn't the only diocese where the Scalabrini ran into trouble. In 1924, complaints from parishes across the country, many about financial abuses, prompted the Vatican to investigate the order and institute reforms. Gender divisions also played a role, but these too were blurred. Women were highly visible in the uprising and conducted an extensive petition drive that put the men's petitions to shame. This wasn't really surprising. The affair offered these women a rare opportunity to voice frustrations with a church whose attitudes toward women were problematic, to say the least. Yet men, too, were deeply involved in the uprising. In fact, the passionate involvement of parish men undermines the assumption that ethnic religiosity was primarily a female affair. Class played a similarly complex role. The trouble at Holy Ghost certainly was informed by economic tensions. There was a clear resentment that Belliati enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle unavailable to most of his parishioners. Yet the movement brought together laborers with small merchants, making this more than a working class uprising. In the end, the only clear-cut division in the Holy Ghost affair was a clash between old world and new, between newcomers who wished to worship in traditional ways and priests who encouraged an Americanized form of worship. The Holy Ghost affair pointed to a congregation divided by a number of deep and overlapping fault lines between northern and southern Italians, men and women, working and upper classes, and old world and new. These types of divisions were present at many other ethnic parishes, and this shouldn't be surprising. As a community center, the church served quite naturally as a stage on which community tensions played out. The Holy Ghost affair is a great story, but what does it tell us as historians? I think it reveals a great deal about immigrants' religion and politics in the first decades of the 20th century. First, it testifies to the importance of the church in immigrant neighborhoods. Had the church not played such a critical role as community center and spiritual home, the Belliati-Vicari affair never would have generated such enormous passion. Even as the Holy Ghost controversy revealed deep conflicts within the congregation, it sent the message that religion mattered. Second, the conflict testifies to the ways in which the parish served as a political space, not only as a training ground where Catholics learned how to raise external challenges to their employers and civic leaders, but also as an arena on which internal tensions played out. Although conflicts like this were deeply troubling to the Catholic hierarchy, I think they send a reassuring message. The church was certainly a hierarchical institution where priests and bishops exerted significant control. What they could not fully control was how parishioners would apply the organizing skills and political convictions they learned at church, how being Catholic would help them to be political. Thank you for listening.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Stern. That was a great presentation. We did have a few questions come into the chat and to me personally, and Bonnie, too, if you got any questions to you personally, do feel free to share those. The first question that came in was, we often hear of the church being anti-labor Where does this generalization start, and how accurate do you believe this is?
Great question. Thank you. Well, the church at this time promoted what it called responsible unionism. It was definitely, virulently anti-socialist and anti-communist, but it was pro-worker. The church couldn't afford to, oppose any and all workplace actions and legislative reforms embraced by congregations that were overwhelmingly working class in many cases. So the church was in Providence was a supporter of mainstream unions, seeing them as an alternative to the much more frightening from their perspectives prospect of socialism.
Very good, thank you. Another question was, please repeat the date and location of the Klan ceremony that you alluded to. I think that was the one in Georgiaville.
Yes.
And they also ask if you could elaborate on Klan activities in Rhode Island.
Sure. The picture was from 1927, and as Mark said, in Georgiaville, a village in Smithfield. And the Klan in the 1920s nationwide transformed from being a Southern anti-Black organization to a nationwide mass movement targeted at whatever the unpopular group was in any given area. So still, of course, focusing on African Americans in the South, but in more industrial areas like Rhode Island, focusing on anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant measures. And this, it really was a mass movement in the 1920s, and just started to fade away by the end of the decade, both as a result of internal scandals and a nationwide shift to worrying about the Depression, at which point cultural issues became less important than economic crisis.
And it looks like there was sort of a follow-up to that. One individual said, I live in Georgiaville. The Catholic Church was across the street from the mill there. Do you have any more information about the church and the mill in Georgiaville specifically?
I'm sorry, I wish I did, but I don't recall coming up, running into any research. When I did this research a long time ago, I don't think I encountered anything specifically about the church and the mill in Georgiaville.
Thank you. Another question was, why were clubs so popular in churches and not in other ethnic institutions?
I think it was because the church was the institution at this time that had the broadest demographic profile, male and female, young and old, immigrant, native, working class, middle class. So there was such a broad demographic to tap into. Churches set up societies that would be appropriate for anyone, right? Different stages of life, different genders, that sort of different, that kind of thing. And I think it was the sheer also accessibility of the church that, as I mentioned, this was the one place at this time when any Catholic could be a member, whereas other institutions were much narrower in their focus and their accessibility.
Awesome. This one should be an easy answer. Were masses in Latin at that time? And I think that that's a broad question, just Catholic Church wide in Rhode Island versus specifically in Georgiaville.
Well, that's actually a good question because, it was common for masses to be in Latin until Vatican II in the 60s. And yet parishes were so, ethnic parishes were so determined to have a priest that shared their ethnicity. So there must have been at least some component of the mass that was conducted in the native language. I'm sorry, I should know that. It was a long time ago that I did this research, and I can't remember that specifically, but I would like to track down that answer.
Yeah, I wonder, like, I would imagine that homilies would probably be in a language that folks could understand.
Right.
It's more formal
And
parts.
hymns too, although of course hymns didn't play as great a role in the Catholic service as they do in Protestant services. But you're right, the homily would have had to be in the native language. And it was so important to parishioners to have a priest from the right place. The French Canadians were particularly intent on this. Religious identity was so caught up with the French commitment to la survivance, the survival of their native language and culture and forms of religion. And even, a Belgian priest, say, who was a French speaker, was not good enough. It had to be a French Canadian priest.
Right. Very cool. Another individual asked, did the church favor any political group? And I'm assuming that means parties or any particular political groups at the time.
Not openly. The church had to be really careful about being partisan because of these, this century-old claim that the church was in league with the Pope to take over the American government. There were all these, widespread conspiracy theories about this in the mid-19th century. And although that level of rabid anti-Catholicism had subsided somewhat by the progressive era, there was still, long-standing concerns among Catholics that they didn't want to give any indication that the church had political designs. So certainly, certain different parishes had different political proclivities, and parishioners used churches to organize politically. Until the 1920s, 1930s, the Irish, of course, were heavily Democratic, but the French Canadians and the Italians skewed Republican, but that started to change in the 20s.
Excellent. Another question was, did the churches try to push the children to enroll in a church school?
Yes, that was definitely a goal. And of course, there weren't enough schools and there weren't enough immigrants who had the money to do that. But it's funny, I was just looking over some of my old book chapters yesterday, and I think I came across statistics that something like maybe a quarter of Catholic families had their children in parochial schools. And, the diocese would have preferred to have every single Catholic child in a parochial school, and especially up in French Canadian areas like Woonsocket, the parochial schools were seen as critical preservers of French Canadian language and identity.
Cool. Well, and I know definitely one of the more interesting parts of your book that I found was how you chart this evolution from the earliest Irish Catholics and really kind of being shunned from the political arena to eventually, I'm going to forget his name, but one particular politician that you highlight towards the end who becomes a senator from Rhode Island.
Oh, Pistori?
There we go.
John
Thank
Pistori.
Pistori. Yeah. I was wondering if you could just kind of elaborate a little bit more on that process for these folks.
Sure, thank you. That's a good question. So one reason that I became so interested in studying Rhode Island, and particularly Providence, which was the major focus of my research, was not only was Providence a very immigrant Rhode Island, a very immigrant and very Catholic state, but it also was an exceptionally undemocratic state. So we're all probably, or most of us, familiar with the Dorr Rebellion fought in 1842 over the fact that by the 1840s, Rhode Island was the only state that still required land for voting. There was still a landholding requirement for voting. This had gone out of fashion in every other place after the Revolution, but Rhode Island, as the first state to industrialize and attract a foreign-born proletariat, was very worried about separating the right to vote from land ownership. And so, as you may know, the upshot or the outcome of the Dorr Rebellion was this 1843 Constitution that set up a bifurcated polity in which natives, both black and white, which is interesting, could vote freely, upon payment of maybe like $1 poll tax or service in the militia, something like that. But immigrants had to own land in order to vote until 1888, which is really, really late. So they went from this initial position of most of them not being able to vote because your typical immigrant in Rhode Island did not have the resources to be a landowner, to becoming having better access to the vote by the late 20th century, by the late 19th century. But there were still, as I mentioned in my talk, class-based restrictions on voting in city elections until 1928. So it took until 1928 for working class immigrants and other Rhode Islanders to have full access to the vote. But as the voting restrictions gradually diminished and different ethnic groups established themselves, they became more and more empowered until the famous bloodless revolution of 1935, in which the Democratic control finally seized control of both the House and the General Assembly and the State Senate and the governorship. And that really changed things.
Great, thank you. So if there are no more questions, and I'm not seeing any new ones, oh, there was just one, as I said that. Can you share any information about conflict between Irish Catholics and the French Canadian Catholics in Woonsocket?
Okay, I know that there was a pew rent strike at a Catholic church in Woonsocket in, I think it was 1914. There were instances when French Canadians would burn an effigy of an unpopular priest. I think that happened at a church in Woonsocket when they were sent a Belgian instead of a French Canadian. There was the famous Sentinel affair of 1922, I think. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but the diocese, which was of course controlled by the Irish, launched a diocesan-wide fund drive to raise funds for parochial schools. That sort of ties in with the earlier question about, was the diocese promoting attendance at parochial schools? Definitely. And the French Canadians were very concerned about this. They felt like this fund drive and sort of mandatory expectation from each parish was going to divert money away from the existing French Canadian parochial schools in favor of a diocesan-wide high school that would be multi-ethnic. And so this was incredibly controversial. It led to also, there was a social movement organized around it, petitions to the Vatican. Quite a few French Canadians who participated got excommunicated, although they were finally exonerated and welcomed back to the church. And if anyone is interested in this, I should mention that the Rhode Island Historical Society is sponsoring a talk on the Sentinel affair tomorrow. I think it's 1 o'clock tomorrow. I just registered for it yesterday, so I'm looking forward to learning more about it.
Yep, Valley Talks is tomorrow at 1 p.m. with them, so definitely should definitely be a fascinating presentation. I was not laughing earlier, but I was contemplating my decision to come down to Florida when you were talking about the Holy Ghost affair, and a priest having a revolt because he would visit Florida over the winter months, and here I am sitting in Florida. I hope that there's not going to be a revolt amongst our everybody on the phone call right now. But I really want to thank you, Dr. Stern, for joining us today. This was an excellent presentation, and hope to have you back at some point.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and to all of you for coming.
This presentation and all of our presentations will be on our YouTube page, as I mentioned earlier, so do check that out, or tell your friends if they missed today that they can access this presentation there. In 2 weeks, on March 20th at 2 p.m., we'll have our 5th lecture in the series. And Dr. Jane Lancaster will discuss, was there one best way? She will investigate and talk about Dr. Lillian Moeller-Gilbreth, who questioned whether there really was only one best way to increase worker efficiency and productivity. So we hope to see you then, and have a lovely weekend, everybody. Stay safe and stay warm back home in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and we hope to see you soon.